Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We like to talk about the ability to be able to go out and enjoy ourselves in nature. And for many of us, that's simply going into the garden. There are many types of gardens. Some people grow gardens so that way they can enjoy the beauty of flowers and trees and shrubs and perhaps even lily pads in a little pond, while others actually like to grow food. That way they can put something on the table. On the program today, we're going to be talking about a book called Conscious Gardening. And our guest today is Michael J. Rhodes, who's going to be telling us about a practical and metaphysical way that we can grow our gardens organically. I'd like to welcome to the program today our guest, Mr. Michael J. Rhodes. Michael, thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel.
Now, I really enjoyed what I was reading here in the book because gardening truly is an attitude, if to say the least. Now, talk about what conscious gardening actually is.
Well, it's a bit like life, really, Daniel. I mean, we can live consciously, we can live subconsciously, or we can probably be laying in a hospital somewhere unconscious.
Right.
And so much of gardening is done subconsciously. In other words, we learn how to do it, and we do it, and so we just continue following a technique that we know that works, and we can be a very, very good gardener. But the only way to really connect with the garden is to be conscious in the moment, alive and aware, and knowing that you're, being with that moment. And that's not common in life, everyday living, and it's certainly not common in the garden. And so when you actually connect consciously with the garden, you can move from being the gardener and just the gardener to becoming a student with nature the teacher, because when you connect in that moment, then you're connecting with something called nature, which is pretty awesome.
Now, the one that I've really found interesting is to go into the garden with cooperation. Describe that.
Well, all nature is cooperation. We see it as competition. When we look at a wild nature, we see it as competition because we look mostly through the left hemisphere of the brain, and we look through the eyes of competition. So to go into the garden to cooperate means that you are, instead of just doing to the garden, you're being with the garden. So you're being with while you're doing to. I wrote a whole chapter on that, being with while you're doing to. And so when you cooperate, it's like if you can accept that everything has consciousness, and science doesn't accept this, but if you accept that everything has consciousness, that the planet Earth has consciousness, and that the soil is not just an innate lump of something there for our benefit, but the soil is a living soil filled with billions of microorganisms in, shall we say, a teaful, and you realize that consciousness, it certainly doesn't have an awareness or a level of consciousness that we do, but it is life. And when you cooperate with that, you find yourself knowing things that you didn't know when you began. So a garden can teach a person and can cooperate. So an example of that is you buy a plant from a nursery, from a garden centre, and you take it home, and you're not quite sure where to put it. And so you hold the pot, and you become aware. You're sort of aware of that moment. And you walk around your garden, and every now and again you stop and put the plant on the soil, and you ask, for instance, okay, is this your place? And it won't just sort of talk to you in an American language, but you'll get the feeling, especially if you're in that moment being conscious, and this is what it's all about. You get the feeling that, no, it doesn't really like it here, or yes, it does. And you continue until you get a very, very strong feeling, yes, this is my place. So that's where you set it, and invariably it thrives.
Mm-hmm. Now, you describe in your book that when it comes to plants, that sometimes you had found yourself spending time trying to keep plants thriving in areas they normally wouldn't. And you just finally said, it's just time to simply let go and allow plants that will thrive to thrive, and the ones that don't will just simply go away.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not, the book I wrote now a few years ago, but I can give you an example. Where I live, we were having a drought, and I was regularly watering the garden, and because where I live, I have to catch all our water. We're not on a town supply of water. And so very clearly I was going to have to run out and keep buying water. So I decided that I would try to get it to rain, and I tried to get it to rain, and that didn't seem a good idea because it seemed rather selfish when there's so many areas where people are dying of lack of water, and all I wanted it for a garden. And so I finally accepted, okay, this garden now is not going to be watered by me anymore. So I walked around the garden, and I gave the garden an image of an English, or shall we say maybe some parts of America, a winter where it's cold, and the plants most of them drop their leaves. And now in my garden in the subtropics, these were all plants that keep their leaves, in fact, flower and thrive all winter. And so I gave them the image that this was like a European winter. In other words, they had to, if they dropped their leaves and went dormant, then they would survive through this. And in fact, we didn't get much rain for the next 9 months. And they did drop their leaves, except for one variety, which all died, without exception, every one of them died. And the other ones all dropped their leaves and looked dead. And I told them, if you want energy, take it from me when I walk around the garden. And I jokingly said, when it rains, you can give it back. And so I never felt them take any energy, but when the rains finally came, I have never seen, none of them leafed up. First they flowered, and I have never seen such an abundance of flowering. And the energy that poured into the garden from them, and it's quite a big garden we're talking about, was absolutely amazing. And I also checked out other gardens in the area. Now I have 2.5 acres of land, so where we are, they're fairly big gardens. But I checked out in other gardens of friends, and none of their plants survived. They all ran out of water, and it got too expensive. And very, very few of the shrubs survived. So what I did, the cooperation I created in the garden, was basically in my garden only. So I lost one species that refused to drop its leaves. Everything else grew and exploded back into growth after flowering. And so I've learned that you can break the rules or bend the rules or even create new rules when you have what I would call a conscious relationship with the garden.
Now, one of the things you talk about in your book, and it's interesting because you say that a garden can actually reflect, not necessarily on its own, but as you go into someone's garden, you say it really astounds you, the comments that you hear people talk about. And as you say, a garden has never really suffered from low self-esteem. It just is, but people tend to. And I thought that was really funny because you might go in and say, oh, that's a nice shrub. Yeah, I know, but, and then all of a sudden all this stuff comes out from somebody. What is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people, of course, take their stuff into the garden. And, they're gardening out of frustration. They think, oh, God, I've got to cut the lawn this weekend. Mm-hmm. And so cutting lawns becomes an outlet for anger and frustration, and the lawns never thrive. I've seen the strangest things. One woman asked me to create a garden for her, and I did. And I did it in the form of the yin and yang. And I put the both same plants in the yin and the yang, and in her garden the yang thrived incredibly well. But the yin, they hardly grew at all. And as I got to know this woman, I realized although she was a small, petite woman, she was incredibly yang, very masculine in her energy. And, she showed me the garden a couple of years later. It looked ridiculous, nothing like I'd planned it. One side was rampant, and the other side looked as if it was dying. And I said to her, look, this is the yang, this is you. I said, this is your garden, it's all about you. I said, you try balancing yourself and and looking at the feminine side of yourself, and let's see what happens in the garden, rather than do anything to the garden. Let's see what happens with you. And so consciously she began to allow her femininity to come out much more. And this is a woman in her 50s, late 50s, so she began to cultivate her own femininity. And over the next 2 years, I pruned down the yang side, and the yin side grew up until everything was even. And when it was all even, she was nicely balanced. And then she died.
Oh, no.
Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
It's funny because gardens really have such miracles that they offer, and they offer willingly. And I remember Alan Watts, late philosopher Alan Watts.
Alan Watts, yeah.
And he had written his autobiography, and what I was astounded by is he was talking about a female artist that he had known who apparently was diagnosed with a tumor, apparently, that was in her brain.
Right.
He said that'd be this pretty terrible surgery that she would have to go through. So, and the chances were fairly slim whether it would work or not. It might prolong her life maybe a few months. She says, "Well, I'll go ahead and just take care of this on my own." And she went into her garden because she was also an artistic gardener, and simply let it go, as he said, and she lived. Actually got rid of the tumor. So it's quite fascinating what really happens within the energy of a garden when you surrender yourself, I suppose, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that's very true, Daniel. Like, for instance, I was working in my garden. I came home from one of my tours, which I'm on now, my spiritual intensive tours, and there had been a drought. We had a lot for quite a prolonged period. El Nino affected us very badly. And La Nina's exactly the opposite. But anyway, I got back, and a part of the lawn had died, which was very shallow soil. And so I decided to put a pond in there. And you probably read this if you read the book. And so I dug out the pond, but I knew that I would hit bedrock, and I knew that I would have to go up with the sides. And I rather like the idea of the high sides to a pond, and the pond so you could sit on the edge of it at a nice seating height. And so I started building it, and I bought a whole 9 cubic meters of a rounded, very rounded granite, salt and pepper granite, they called it. And I realized at that stage, okay, well, this is a bit ambitious. I've never laid a brick in my life, so now I'm going to concrete these things, which a brick would be easy by comparison. And so for 2 weeks I labored on this. I would try to get these granite to go in the right places, and I could never find the right size that I wanted, and I prop in them with bits of wood to try to keep them to hold on until the cement set. And I was really struggling. And then one day, as I was working my way through this, I realized that I was grumbling and groaning and moaning and blaming the granite. Everything was wrong except me. Everything.
Right.
Nothing. It was. And then I thought, okay, now how about trying this consciously? How about quit moaning and groaning and be fully conscious in the moment, no other thoughts, focus. And so I came into the moment and I focused and I began to work, and gradually there became like a rhythm in what I was doing. And gradually I had heaps of granite all the way around the pond, which was quite a big one. And gradually I began to realize that as I was laying the granite, there would be a piece there in that heap there. That would be the perfect shape and size. And I'd go over there, and there it was. And then the next piece to lay, then I knew exactly where that was. Heap by heap, I knew where they were, even when they were buried. I knew where the granite was. And I didn't understand it, but I thought, I like this. Mm-hmm. And gradually, day by day, I worked on it. It became effortless. I was full of energy. It became like singing a song, moving from having no voice to being able to sing very capably. And as I laid the last piece of granite, I had this sudden, massive realization that when you look at life metaphysically, all time occupies the same space. Linear time is to the physical linear world or biological world, but metaphysically, all time occupies the same space. And I realized that in a greater reality, the moment I laid the first piece of granite and the last piece of granite was the same moment. And every piece of granite, metaphysically, was laid before I touched it physically. And every piece of granite knew its own place. And when I was in that moment with them, then I knew exactly the piece of granite that should be laid and where it should be put. And it went incredibly. Now, maybe some of your listeners will say, well, okay, that's about as far-fetched as sounds fantasy. But that's exactly how it worked. And if anybody else was to get into that conscious space and try it, they would find for themselves.
Well, in a way, too, I remember when I was in my early 20s, I decided it was just all of a sudden Zen was something I wanted to pursue, you know.
Right.
And so a good many years
later... There's always a timing to truth.
Exactly. And it was interesting because I was also reading, it was a book about the teachings of Don Juan, and he talks about being in your space, that once you're in that space, you will never feel comfort or more rest than you will be when you find where that space was, as he was describing to his
Exactly
disciples.
Right. I live in that space.
Exactly.
I know exactly what you mean.
And it was funny because when I was in my 30s, I was playing basketball with a friend of mine one time, and it was an uneven slope. It was an outdoor hoop at a grade school. And he says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and pick a spot here, and you're going to make a shot, and if you make that shot, then you're going to have bragging rights. So I started bringing all this together. The sun was starting to go down behind the hillside there, and this was a shot that was pretty close to the half-court line as it would be on a regular basketball court. Again, the slope, it slopes up toward the hoop, and I started thinking about that, to be in the space. So I just kind of dribbled the ball a couple of times, just kind of settled into it. And the strangest thing happened. It was like all at once the shot released itself. I wasn't even looking. I literally was not even looking at the basket. And it drops into the bottom of the net. He just stood there. And I said, you won't believe this, but it would be a term in the Zen as the shot just releasing itself. And it was an amazing feeling. And you certainly described through your book, that's really our goal with gardening, is to simply...
That's exactly right. I mean, not only that, of course. In a way, I wrote the book because I wanted it to be a bit of a metaphor for life as well, but I also wanted it as a book of conscious gardening. I write a lot of books, and I've written two gardening books before that. I wrote the first ever organic gardening book for Australia, and then I wrote another one a few years later, but I figured the conscious gardening, I just wanted to bring it up to date to say the things I want to say. I mean, I don't know whether I put it in there, but when I was a boy of about 12, a friend of mine had an elderly aunt, a great aunt, and she was in her 90s. And I went to her garden quite a number of times with Richard. And the sweet old lady, she lived in a terraced house, in a row of terraced houses. And she was somewhere in the middle, and each house garden, which was quite small, was divided by a high wall. It must have been 8-9 feet high, with the occasional trees. And so, England being what it was in those days, you didn't see a lot of sun in that garden. And every time I went in her garden, it was a riot of colour, absolute riot of colour. Now, at that age, I had a collection of over 200 plants. I got into gardening when I was 6, and I had a collection of over 200 plants. And I knew perfectly well that many of those plants in her garden simply did not get enough sun to flower. They shouldn't be flowering. They should be plenty of green on them, but no flowers because there wasn't enough sun. And then I was watching her and feeling her energy as she walked around. And even though I was only about 12, because I was so into plants, I suddenly realized I had this flash of insight that she was the sun in her garden.
Ah.
And I never forgot that moment. And I realized many times since then I was right, there's no question. She was you could say she held the sun in her soul. She was the sun in the garden. She had things flowering and growing that just shouldn't do it there and didn't do it anywhere else. And so since then, in my gardens that I've had at different places of the world, that's why I was able to cover, quite a number of climates. In the gardens that I've had, I never forgot that, and I realized that certainly there are certain rules, but you can transcend them. Like I used to do a talkback program in Tasmania, and this woman said one thing she loved to do when at 9 o'clock every morning, her kids had gone to school. And of course, people could ring in anonymously. The only thing they say is their name, so you have no idea who they are because you don't see them on radio. And she said, I love to get in the bath, and I lay in the bath for half an hour and I relax. And she said, standing by the window, there's only a single window in the bathroom, there was a great big ivy, a Hedera canariensis. And she said, and I love that plant. She said, I love it. And she said, I asked it if it would grow away from the window, right round where the ceiling meets the wall, and then back to the window again. So she was asking this plant to grow away from light. And I said, wow, that's asking a bit much. She said, it's been round once, she said, and now it's on its second circuit. She said, growing away from the light. And I understood that. I said, yes. I said, when you love something the way you love that plant, they'll follow your wish, your will, or whatever. And pretty amazing. I could tell you a lot of stories like that.
Well, no, and I actually really understand. I have plants within the house, and I remember as I was living in an apartment in my late 20s, is that I had just little plants all over the place. People would say, you've got such a green thumb, and I said, actually, it's quite easy. I just give them water probably every week and a half to 2 weeks, and they pretty much just do their own thing, and they were thriving. An interesting thing is that I moved from there into a home that was a much, much older home, and my attitude seemed to decline, my energy seemed to decline, and pretty much the plants did the same thing to the point where they became non-existent, unfortunately. But I also understood it's because I was letting myself go. It could have been just the energy of the house, but certainly it was my energy.
Well, houses do have energy, and so do gardens. I mean, everything... everything on Earth, everything is a field of energy. Everything is a field of energy. Human, a plant, everything in the end is just a field of energy. And once you begin to understand that energy, you can do what people would call the miracles. Mm-hmm. One of the little old ladies who phoned me, she said she and her husband had a big apple tree in their garden, and every year it flowered profusely. And she said, in 20 years, we never had a single apple. And she said, my husband had died a few years ago, and she said, and I looked at that apple tree on flower, and she said, I thought to myself, you fraud. She said, I've had enough. And so she said, I went down the garden to my late husband where he had his little garden shed, and she said, and I opened it up, and there was his old axe, she said, there. It's heavy, she said. So she said, I dragged it across the lawn to the apple tree, and she said, when I got to the apple tree, I said to the apple tree, okay, do you see this axe, Mr. Apple Tree? If you don't give me apples this year, she said, I'm going to chop you down if it takes me 3 months to do it. And of course, in the studio, we were roaring with laughter. And she said, you can laugh, young man, and I was considerably younger then. She said, but she said, last year I had loads of apples for the first time ever. And she said, so this spring when it was on flower, I went down there again, and she said, you remember me? She said, I'm telling you, she said, I'm the one who told you last year. She said, do you remember what I told you? She said, if you don't give me apples this year, the same thing applies. I'll chop you down. And we laughed again, and she said that it's not apple season yet, but she said the tree is covered in green apples. And she said, so I'm going to get another bumper crop this year. But then people started ringing in, how's this possible? How does it work? And what I was telling people was, it was her clarity. She was completely clear about what she wanted. So she put her will out to the tree, and although she put it out in her way, the tree responded to her absolute clarity, because most humans are just a walking maze of confusion. Mm-hmm. Whereas everything in nature is absolute clarity. So when a human being comes into the moment and they are conscious, then their consciousness connects with the consciousness of the garden, because it can't connect. A subconsciousness does not connect with consciousness, and most humans spend about 95% of their life in a subconscious state, whereas nature is completely conscious the whole time. Otherwise, a species wouldn't last long. We wouldn't last long under normal circumstances, but we've created a society which which basically supports subconscious inefficiency.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another subject.
I was just reminded of a book called The Secret Life of Plants when you were talking about this lady carrying the axe, and I think it even goes even further, as you were saying, that she was clear that she really didn't have to verbalize it to the tree. The tree already...
She didn't need to do any of that. The tree would have got it anyway.
Would have got it anyway because they believe, or there's which I believe, that plants are very psychic. They can pick up on your attitudes far before you intend or say anything. So
it's fascinating. Another woman phoned. She and her husband were retired, and down each side of the path that led to the road that went past their house, there was about 10 yards of path, and on each side it was a plant called miller's dust, which is a creeping plant with a grey leaf and a white flower, or dusty miller some call it, but it kept growing onto the path, and they were frightened of slipping or tripping because of breaking their hips. And so she, every so often, she said, I would have to cut it back off the path. And she said, one time I did it, and she said, I thought, okay, that's it. So she said, I told the plant, if you dare to put one leaf on this plant, on this path again, either side of you, if you put one leaf back on it, I'm going to dig you all up, and you're going to the tip, and there you will die. And she said, do you know, she said, that was 18 months ago, she said, it hasn't put one leaf over on our path. She said it grows into the lawn, but she said it does not grow onto our path. And she said, we don't mind it growing on the lawn. She said, my husband can cut it with a lawnmower, but she said it doesn't come on the path now.
Oh, wow.
And again, clarity.
Mm-hmm.
She reached the point where she's very clear on what she wanted, and that was to have a clear path. And, the stories go on, but while she was doing that, she was conscious. There was no longer the subconscious gobbledygook that goes on in a human. She was fully conscious and fully knowing what she wanted. Like when a tomcat goes around and sprays on his territory, sprays his urine on his territory. He's not putting out a message, I think maybe this is my territory, and any other tomcat strays in here, maybe we'll have to discuss it. What he's saying is, come in here and I'll kill you. And, nature doesn't really relate with death, but it does relate to clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And his message in his urine was very clear. You're in trouble if you come in here.
Mm-hmm.
One woman in America told me that she had a blueberry patch, and she said every year black bears would come in and they'd all rear up against the trees and scratch. And so any bear that came in, he'd do his scratching. If it scratched well above him, he would have a few mouthfuls and take off. And so each year she would get the rake and pee on the rake and then scratch well above all the other bears. And she said none of them stayed around for long. They just figured that whatever the hell that was that could scratch that high, it was big and dangerous.
That's funny. For our listeners out there in this book, Conscious Gardening, what's fascinating is although you cover what can be considered some technical ways of gardening, such as fertilizers, such as even types of plants, is that really, and you don't have really any pictures in here whatsoever, is that you're completely talking about gardening just as we are here on the program. It's about
That's right. In fact, I've had very high praise for those two chapters, the how and why of fertilizers and the living soil. I have had praise for them in Australia, where one guy had never done a book review in 25 years of radio weekly talkback on gardening, and he said, this book is too important. He said, I have to tell you. He said, those two chapters, for the layman, he said, are the most clear and concise and absolutely educational chapters, he said, you could read on the subject anywhere.
Fascinating stuff. Michael, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program. Is there a website people can follow your work?
Well, yes, they can go to www.michaelrhodes.com.
Very good. Michael Rhodes, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel. That was nice.
Thank you. Again, the book is Conscious Gardening, Practical and Metaphysical Expert Advice on How to Grow Your Own Garden Organically, which also means growing yourself organically as well. Be sure to visit us at our website, which is beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.